Welcome to Diamonds and Dumpster Fires, the podcast where faith meets real life and we figure out how to heal when everything's fallen apart. I'm your host, Melly, and I have lived through the mess and got curious about what actually helps us rebuild, from both faith and brain science. Let's untangle the hard stuff together and find some hope in the rubble. Are you ready? Let's go. Hi, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. Today, we're diving into an important conversation about ADHD and autism in the middle of some of life's biggest challenges, things like trauma, relationships, and especially divorce. My guest today is Dr. Robert Melillo, a world-renowned expert in brain health, specializing in childhood and adult neurological disorders. He's a clinician, professor, brain researcher, and the best-selling author of Disconnected Kids. He focuses on ADHD, autism, OCD, tics, anxiety, and other developmental issues. Dr. Melillo is dedicated to bridging brain function, behavior, and physical health. His innovative multimodal approach, the Melillo method, has transformed thousands of lives. So join us as we explore his groundbreaking work and unique insights into the brain. Welcome, Dr. Melillo. I'm so excited to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. Well, let's start with kind of a big picture question. I'd love to talk about how these neurological conditions like ADHD and autism can show up in times of disruption, or what I like to call here on this show, the dumpster fire times of life.
Well, a lot of what happens when the brain is in a more immature state or in an unbalanced state is it can often really disrupt our ability to emotionally regulate. Ultimately, the brain is the source of everything. So being able to feel emotions is in the brain, and then being able to regulate the emotions appropriately are in the brain. How we react to different situations is really based on our perception of what is happening, which again is, depends on how our brain is perceiving what's happening around us. It also is superimposed on our physiological stress response in our body. Are we in a fight or flight state neurologically as a baseline? Do we have the ability to go into a rest and digest state and be more relaxed? And then, there's obviously how we're raised and all the other factors around that. But, the handling those situations and dealing with those situations is really more of a neurological response. And what we tend to see is that if the brain is underdeveloped, if the brain is unbalanced, that stressful situations, anxiety, those things tend to bring them out more, and they tend to exaggerate what's already there. And the reactions may be overreactive or underreactive, or they don't fit appropriately the situation.
Interesting. Now, would that be the same for both children going through a traumatic experience and adults that both have these neurological conditions?
Yeah, well, most of the things that we see, even most adult mental health issues, really go back to childhood. We now know that, 90% of all mental health issues really start in childhood, maybe in the womb, maybe even some preconception. It doesn't mean that adults can't be exposed to traumatic events or have different psychological things, but more of the susceptibility goes back to childhood. And especially there's been a lot of research around what we call adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. One of the biggest studies ever done looked at 20-something thousand files through Kaiser Permanente, and this was done in the 80s. And they basically saw that there were 10 what they called adverse childhood experiences that were essentially traumatic events. And they categorized these. And a lot of them were verbal, physical neglect, verbal, physical abuse. If a caregiver was incarcerated, if there was substance addiction in the house, if there was violence in the house, that made up most of the 10. And they found that if people had 4 or more of them, that they were also susceptible anywhere from 400 to 1,200% increase to a whole array of physical and mental health issues. So even things like cancer, diabetes, hypertension, as well as depression, anxiety, things of that nature. And really interesting is that they tended to die 20 years earlier. And when they looked at trying to say, why, The bottom line was that they saw that it caused or resulted in some sort of neurodevelopmental delay. So there was this delay or alteration of neurodevelopment that had an impact on brain development, and that had an impact on overall health and lifespan of health. So, really I work with people, almost everybody I work with has some sort of developmental neuro delay and imbalance. And most of those people actually come from great families and didn't go through any, and we actually have them fill it out. And most of them, their ACEs score is 0 or 1. So neurodevelopmental delays can happen because of abuse or trauma or neglect, but also they can happen just as a course of development that just goes off track a little bit. And we see that a lot, and especially if people are unusually gifted in certain areas of the brain, they're more vulnerable to imbalances.
That's really interesting. So if somebody is happening to have some kind of gifting, it is more likely then that they would develop some kind of neurological condition?
Yeah. Did you ever hear the term, there's a thin line between genius and insanity?
Yes,
Right.
I
So
have.
I've always wondered about that since I was a kid. I used to love reading books about, famous, successful people and watching movies about their lives, and they always tended to end tragically. Whether it's substance abuse or suicide or whatever. And that statement would always come up. Well, there's a thin line between genius and insanity. And I always wondered, why is that? Why isn't someone who's a genius, why wouldn't they just be happy? Why wouldn't they just live a great life? And yet it didn't seem to be the case. So I think, some of those early things, I think my first paper I ever did in grammar school in fifth grade was on schizophrenia. So I think I've always been interested in this. And I think my work actually answers that these imbalances in the brain, if you have an area of the brain on one side in particular that you're really skilled at. When we say someone is gifted or talented or intelligent, what does that mean? From a neuroscience perspective, it literally means there are areas of their brain that control a certain function that are more connected, that have more connections or stronger connections and faster connections. And we can actually literally see it and measure it, and their brain waves are faster than most people. When that happens on the other side of the brain, we tend to see looser connections or slower activity because the brain tends to work in this cooperatively but competitive way. And so therefore, the stronger a trait is, the stronger the ability is. And many of these traits run in families, the whole family is great musicians, or the whole family are engineers, and everybody in the family might be good at math or at reading or at writing. And these are traits that run in the family that are good. But if we get too strong of a trait, it also usually comes with a potential vulnerability for a weakness. And that is where the disability or the, I don't like to say insanity, but where the mental health issue may arise. But the good news is that we can change that. We can bring that weakness up without bringing the strength down.
Interesting. Can you dive into a little bit of how that would work? Say somebody has a real leaning towards, say, math, but maybe their social skills are not necessarily fully developed.
Exactly. So that would be a classic example of really like a classic ADHD, or like someone that would be, let's say, in the Asperger's realm, what we used to call, where they might be really good at basic math or math calculations. They may have genius level skills, and those are left brain skills, but yet socialization, emotional regulation is really typically more right brain skills. And so, we look at that, and first of all, why is there imbalance? Well, as we said, one, it might be superimposed, that if we look at the family that the child comes from or that individual comes from, there may have been other people in the family that had that similar trait, that they were, like Simon Baron-Cohen out of Cambridge in the 90s showed that in families of kids with autism, there were many more physicists and mathematicians and engineers. Later on, he went to show that there were also more people in the finance world, or doctors or lawyers, or then he showed that there was a lot of people in the IT industry, software engineers. So, what do those jobs all have in common? Those are more left brain dominant skills. So we get people that are left brain dominant, and they may be very intelligent and very good and have kind of like that engineering type of brain, but they may not be so good in socialization. They may not be good at reading other people or situations or understanding other people's emotions, because those are right brain skills. And so those are where these imbalances can be, and they can develop and they can be accentuated early on in the womb and during development and during birth. If someone's not going through their milestones the way they should, or if they're skipping them, or if there's something that interferes with their early development, it might accentuate this and accentuate weaknesses and gifts. And so we can change that. One is we can go back and look at, where was the glitch and what was the glitch? Was it prenatal? Was it the birth process itself? Were they on track? Where did things kind of go off? And then we can go back and do things to be able to help that.
So is it mostly like exercises, brain type exercises that you would give somebody once you've pinpointed exactly where things maybe went off the track a bit?
It's a combination. So the first way they usually go track is usually more with physical movement and with the way that they're processing sensory information. So the human brain is unique. We all know that, but most people don't realize how unique it is. And what's unique about it is really the way that it grows. And this is because, first of all, we as humans have the biggest brain per body size of any primate. But because we're the only bipedal primates, we also have the smallest birth canal. So we have the biggest head with the smallest birth canal. That's a problem that no other animal has to navigate. And we've had to come up with a way to navigate that through nature. And so we've had to modify our genes that build our brain, which are 84% of our genes. And we've had to restrict the growth of the brain in the womb so that it isn't growing too soon, too fast. Otherwise, it won't get out. And obviously, that's not conducive to life of the mother or the child. So when our brain is born, it is very, very immature relative to any other animal. And it's small. It's only about 20 or 25% of the adult size. And by age 3, it will be 90%. So what we see is that 75 to 80% of our brain growth happens outside the womb in an uncontrolled setting. Almost every other animal, the majority of their brain grows in the womb, in a controlled setting. So what happens during the stages of development for us, especially in the first few years, is really critical. If anything deviates from the optimal way that the brain develops, it can throw our brain a little bit off track. And over the course of 5 or 10 or 15 or 20 years, it can end up with a big impact, right? Yeah. So that we can end up with schizophrenia when we're at 25. But it really started early on because the growth of the brain was thrown a little bit off track. And so the first thing that one of my main areas of research is looking at what's called primitive reflexes. So we need to be able to move to be able to grow our brain. But when we're born, we really don't have ability to move volitionally. I mean, a horse will run in under 2 hours of being born. We won't walk until 12 months. So we're born with these reflexes that allow us to move. They allow the baby to get in the right position in the womb and get out of the womb and then roll over and crawl on their belly and crawl on all fours. And right around 1 year, a child should stand up. They should be able to walk a few steps and talk a few words and point and have good eye contact. If they don't do all of that, and if it doesn't happen the way it's supposed to, even slight deviations are big red flags that something's happening. So usually the reason is that these reflexes aren't coming on the way they're supposed to, and then they don't go away. At the end of 1 year, they should be gone, and they should allow for the next stage of development. And if that doesn't happen, that alters the maturity of the brain and usually leads to these imbalances. And that is usually the root cause of most of these issues. So what we need to do is go back and change their physical movements. We need to get rid of these reflexes. We need to improve their motor ability and their sensory ability and their sensory processing. And that is really the initial aspect. But then we do need to do some cognitive training, and we do need to do some sensory stimulation. And we may need to do, also diet and nutrition, because the brain also regulates the health of the body.
Wow, that's really interesting. Now, one thing I do want to touch on a little bit is about adults that have been late diagnosed with ADHD. I did see on your website that you say most adults with ADHD have probably had it their whole lives, but that it can develop at any times. It sounds like in an adult that hadn't been diagnosed, most likely it's these same things that you're talking about, these different reflexes and things as a child. But what does it mean for it to develop at any time? What are some of the ways that could happen?
Well, what we're talking about is just altering developmental trajectory. And our brain is really still developing, probably into the 40s and even maybe up to 50 years old, that it's still maturing. Studies out there say that the brain is only developing up till 25, but those studies only looked until 25. But we do know that the brain is developing myelin, the covering of it. So it's myelinating until we're around 50. So what I'm saying is that a little alteration in the trajectory of the brain in, the wrong way may not show up right away. Like, for instance, autism usually shows up within the first 3 years, 3 to 4 years. We usually see it. ADHD may not show up typically till 6 or 7, around there. Dyslexia, learning disabilities may not show up until 10, 11, 12. Schizophrenia doesn't usually show up until 20s. Bipolar may not show up until the 30s. So, and even adult ADHD might, the full impact on it may not be realized until later on in life. But the brain is also dynamic. The way we use it can also create imbalances. If you get somebody, let's say, who's an accountant, and they're really good with numbers, and they're really left brain dominant, and their left brain is strong to begin with, and then they go through accounting season, and they do all these numbers over and over and over and over and over, and they're just doing that left brain skill, they can literally make their right brain go down to where they could, almost seem to be autistic, where their social skills could be so limited. I had a person I worked with that was like that. It was very left brain, very bright guy. And he worked with me, and he would go through financial models, and he would do them for days on end. And we'd get together and we'd have a meeting, and he would go the whole meeting without looking one person in the eye or saying one word. I mean, you talk about 3 hours, person's a CFO, and they're not saying a word in a meeting. And I would say to him, you can't just do financial models over and over. It completely tips your brain out of balance. And so, whereas other times he was a very social guy, normally he was a great athlete. So the brain is dynamic, and we can, if we use one side too much, we can tip it out of balance, and we can create distractibility. And so that's where, if you're gifted and you use one side of your brain as part of your job and part of your gift, if you do that too much, you can actually tip it out of balance, which can create all different types of mental health issues, anxieties, depression, mania, as well as, causing stress responses, all different types of things.
Would you say if somebody were to, in their adult years, go through something rather traumatic, could that shift the brain out of alignment as well?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the brain is so active and so dynamic, and the human brain especially. It operates so fast, and it's all about connectivity and sharing information and integration of networks. And so anything that's that dynamic is also fairly delicate. Again, the brain is very dynamic. And so with that, and that's one of our greatest advantages, it's also very adaptable. And the genes that regulate brain growth, development, and function are the most sensitive genes we have. And that makes our brain the most adaptable, which is an advantage. Neuroscientists refer to the human brain as the Swiss Army knife of brains. I mean, we have incredibly adaptable brains. But with that also comes vulnerabilities, meaning that we're more susceptible to negative influences. Our brain is more dynamic and more easily thrown out of balance. It's like, if you have a Ferrari, it's very high performing, and it's probably going to end up in the shop a lot more than a Toyota, right? And that's kind of the brain. We have the highest functioning, the most sophisticated brain that has ever been created. Walking upright is the hardest thing from a motor standpoint other than speech. Speech is the most complicated motor act that's ever been achieved by any animal ever on the planet. So, our brain does amazing things and functions at a high way, but there are also dynamic functional imbalances. And this is where, in the old days, people would talk about chemical imbalances. We know that chemical imbalances don't really exist, but functional network imbalances do. And they are the root cause. I mean, in almost anybody with any mental health or any, developmental neurological issue, there is no brain injury. There is no genetic mutation. We do an MRI of the brain and it looks perfectly normal. We do blood tests and they look relatively normal. And so what's the problem? The problem comes down to this delicate balance that is built on the way the brain grows and develops and matures. And anything that disconnects or interferes with that communication is going to accentuate certain areas of the brain, and too much of that produces symptoms. And it may decrease other areas of the brain, and too much of that creates another group of symptoms. And when we group them together, we call them things like ADHD or autism or OCD or depression or anxiety or bipolar. And that's what it is.
Wow, very interesting. I'd love to just kind of shift gears here a little bit to talk about relationships. Relationships are challenging even under the best of circumstances, but conditions like ADHD and autism can sometimes create like emotional mismatches or misunderstandings or even strengths that might get overlooked. I'd love to know your take on how these conditions affect romantic relationships, especially when maybe only one partner has one of these conditions.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And again, my perspective always first and foremost is talking from a neuroscience perspective. So I understand that any sort of relationship, there's a lot of dynamics that come into it, right?
Right.
And when we look at attachment styles, that's a whole nother thing, which is also neurological, but also based on how you were raised, the type of attachment that your parents had with you. And your attachment style really is what defines your relationships in almost all men and women. And that can be defined when you're 1 year of age. I mean, that's what the studies show. But that's superimposed on your natural, are you more of a right brain or left brain dominant person? But the right brain is really driven by relationships. The main job of the right hemisphere is to connect with other people. So when the brain is developing, the right brain takes the lead in development for the first 3 years, and then the left brain comes online. And since the right brain is developing first, the first thing we need to do is survive. And the most critical thing for humans in survival is that we must attach to other people. Babies can't survive without their parents. They must attach to them. And then we need to attach to other humans. The only reason why we've survived all of these millennia is because we are social animals and have learned to group together. In the Stone Age, if you didn't get along with people and you got kicked out of a group, it was literally a death sentence. You could not survive alone. So hardwired into our brain and into our right brain is that we have to have other people love us. We have to have other people protect us. And therefore, we need to be able to fit in. We need to be able to understand how to get along with people and socialize and read social cues. And that also means we need to be in touch with our emotions so we can be in touch with other people's emotions. And so the right brain really drives attachment, social, and emotional interactions more than anything else. The left hemisphere doesn't really care that much about social or emotional attachments, quite honestly. It's more interested in information, data, facts, more just pure intellectual pursuits, more isolated, it's more individualized. We could look at it that the left brain is more the ego and the right brain is more the id, according to Freud terms. And so what we see is that if we have a deficit on the right side and too much left, now these are people that may really struggle in social and relationships. They may be highly intelligent. They may be brilliant. They may be geniuses in certain areas. but they may really struggle with emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is really the right brain intelligence. And they may struggle with that. They may not read social cues. They may not be driven that much. We get kids on the autism spectrum, and right from the beginning, many of them have no interest in other children. They want to be by themselves. They play by themselves, whereas most children should be approaching other children at young ages and going up to them and being like puppies and rolling around and learning how to do. And we get kids that, have these huge left brains, and they may have no interest at all. They don't approach anybody else, and they're just not driven by that. And they struggle in that area. On the other hand, we get people that are so right brain dominant, that are these, more creative types, more social types, and they may be oversensitive, and they struggle with a lot of social anxiety because the right brain emotions are things like sadness, fear, shame, guilt, embarrassment, but also rejection sensitivity. The biggest fear of the right brain is rejection because, again, if we're rejected by a group, we die. So that may be hardwired, and we get some people that have what's called rejection sensitivity dysphoria, where they're so overly sensitive and they always feel like they're being judged by others, and they always feel a certain level of social anxiety. And the right brain wants to be loved, and it wants people to, embrace it, and it wants to be liked, but yet it's also deathly afraid of rejection. A lot of great creative artists struggle with this every day.
That's really interesting. And I have heard of RSD and how that can affect relationships. What would be your advice for someone maybe who is either dating or in some kind of romantic relationship with somebody who does present with RSD? What is a way you can navigate that with compassion and understanding?
Yeah, one of the things is that, people who have that, they're hypersensitive to almost anything that comes across as criticism. And so it's hard because it's really not the fault of the individual. You may say anything, and that person may look at it as a criticism because their brain is so out of balance and so highly sensitive. There's a network called the salience network. And these tend to be many people that also may have struggled with dyslexia. My daughter and I have a podcast called The Right Brain, WRITE, where it's all about this because she struggled with a lot of these issues as a kid. She was basically dyslexic, dyscalculic. She struggled with spelling and writing, even though she hid all of it, and she worked really hard, and we could barely know that it was there. But she also struggled with a lot of anxiety as a kid and fears that something bad was going to happen. But, she started singing from the time she was born. And when she was 9, 10 years old, she started writing songs just out of her head that were incredible. Now she's a real big up and coming singer-songwriter in Nashville, and Zach Brown produced her first album and she opened for him. And now she's writing with the top songwriters in the world in Nashville. And she's only been there for 3 years. So that gift of being an incredible songwriter came, which is a right brain skill, came with this deficit on the left, but also it came with all of these emotional issues and that idea of fear of rejection and criticism and embarrassment and shame. And so, we talk about how to navigate that, but the bottom line is the easiest way is to change your brain, is to actually calm that down and make the other side higher. It's like, I look at things we know that the left brain generates joy and happiness, pride, also anger, and the right brain generates sadness, fear, shame, guilt, embarrassment, rejection, sensitivity, but also empathy and love and connection and attachment. So if we look at somebody that, let's say, has a deficit on the left side of their brain and their right brain is overactive, we can see decreased joy and happiness, decreased pride, too much sadness, along with guilt and shame. And that's literally the definition of major depressive disorder. And you can go to therapy and you can take medication, and all of that may help and manage symptoms. But you're not dealing with the root cause because it may have no relationship. That person may go into a massive depression because, their girlfriend broke up with them. Whereas somebody else, the girlfriend or boyfriend breaks up with them and they're sad for a couple of days and then they move on and they're fine. What's the difference? It's not the breakup. It's their reaction. And why was their reaction so severe and so different? It was because of the imbalance in their brain and these emotional networks and how their brain is perceiving it and reacting it and emotionally regulating them.
Is there any kind of techniques or anything, like somebody who's listening to this? A lot of people that listen to my podcast are going through breakups and divorces. And if they are recognizing themselves in this scenario and thinking, I might have RSD, or they know they've been diagnosed with ADHD and have this, what are some like practical things they can do now to sort of help them get through this time?
Yeah. So, one of the things I would suggest is, to really understand this. It is pretty complex. The best way is to go to somebody who's trained to be able to look at it from this perspective. And I've developed what's called the Melillo method, which is, 30-year plus career that I've worked on. And I've written over 100 scientific papers, and I have multiple degrees in neurology and rehabilitation and neuropsychology. I have a PhD in developmental cognitive neuroscience. I've written textbooks. I have 8 best-selling books. But my primary book is a book called Disconnected Kids. And it really outlines all of this and talks about it in practical terms and gives people a way of really assessing themselves with checklists. Are you more of a right brain or left brain dominant personality style? Which is fine. That's not good or bad. That's just like saying, are you right hand dominant or left hand dominant? Or are you ambidextrous? And what does that mean? Or we have a cognitive style. I mean, all of us see the world a little bit more through the right brain or a little bit more through the left brain. Some of us are really evenly balanced. Others are really very unbalanced. And the more unbalanced, the more gifted someone may be, but the more unbalanced, the more vulnerable they are. And so determining, are you a right brain or left brain dominant person? And then do you have a weakness on one side or the other, that's where the symptoms come from, whatever it is. And then how does it relate to things like in your motor skills or in the way that you process sensory information, sound, light, smell? Do you get dizzy? Do you get vertigo? Do you have problems seeing certain things or hearing things, or you hear less on one side and more than the other? Are you more or less sensitive to hot or cold? So there's a lot of different things there. And then is it having an impact? Did it have an impact on your academics? Did you struggle in school in any way? Were you an exceptionally good student in math or spelling? Or did you really struggle in basic reading and were dyslexic, or probably should have been labeled dyslexic? Or you really struggled in math or memory, but you might have been really good at reading comprehension. You understood what the book was about. You understood the meaning of the story. You weren't good at basic math, but you were really good at geometry and actually, more problem solving. So there's all these things. And then what's going on in your body? Do you have a lot of inflammation in your body? Do you have a weak immune system? Have you had a chronic history of getting infections and not getting over them and having, chronically goopy nose, or that you got ear infections as a kid and were chronically on antibiotics? Or do you have an overactive immune system? Did you have eczema when you were a kid? Did you have autoimmune issues? Did you end up, with thyroid, Hashimoto's? Did you have any digestive issues? Do you have gluten or dairy sensitivities or allergies? Are you constipated? Do you tend towards diarrhea? All of that is related to your brain and brain development and the way it works. And it's all interrelated. And so looking at all of that, and I go through all of this in pretty good detail for a way for you to assess yourself. And then I give you specific activities. Now, it's geared towards kids, but as I said, adults, 90% of adult mental health issues really started in childhood. So it's a way of going back and looking at yourself from a child perspective and then projecting forward and saying, okay, this is me. I was that kind of kid, and now these are the things I can do to help change that. Other than that, I've trained doctors and therapists all over the world who are trained in my method. We have 2 top clinics in New York, one in New York City, one on Long Island. And this is what we work with every day. And I've developed this, and, we're the best in the world at doing this. And, they can look at that. I have a lot of information available on my website, drrobertmelillo.com. I have a very active Instagram. I'm over 1 million followers now, and we're always putting out information. Like I said, I have 100 papers out there that are all open access. Anybody can read them at any time. So there's a lot of information out there for help.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Now, going back to this idea of divorce, now I'd love to chat a little bit more about what people can do when their child has ADHD or autism and they are in the midst of a divorce. Is there specific ways in which children with these conditions typically tend to respond to the disruption of divorce compared to children without these conditions?
Yes, divorce, and again, nothing I'm saying is meant to sound judgmental. I'm just coming at it from a clinical perspective, but divorce makes all of them worse. It's very difficult because what happens is for any child, they want security, they want to feel safe. And when both parents aren't on the same page, even if they're not divorced, but they're completely on different pages and they react completely differently to the same issue. One parent, the child does something, breaks a rule, and the parent doesn't react. Another parent overreacts. And that creates a lot of uncertainty and anxiety in a child and in their life and in their environment. And that may show up as negative behavior, as an overly emotional or defiant behavior. There's a lot of things that come out. And naturally, when there's a divorce, even when it comes to parenting, most of the parents are not going to be on the same page, right? They're angry, they're fighting. They may even be directly working against one another, sabotaging one another. And that creates an incredibly uncertain, anxious environment. And as you said from the very beginning, all of these things, any of these imbalances, when there are stressful situations, they're only going to be exacerbated. And all of these things come out more. And divorce is a big one for kids because, they want stability. They want rules. They want to know. And what happens often when there is a divorce, the stability and the rules kind of go out. Both parents aren't doing the same thing. They may be trying to win the affection of the child. So, they let them get away with things that they normally wouldn't get away with, or they may spoil them in certain ways or neglect them in certain ways. And it just is tough. And it's tough for a child that has a balanced development. But if you have a child that has imbalanced development, it's much harder. And so when I'm working with divorced families, the first thing I try to do is say, listen, first thing we got to do is get both of you on the same page. We can develop a program that can help your child and that can reduce or eliminate ADHD or dyslexia or OCD or tics or whatever, but not if you're not both working together, because it just won't work. There's activities, there's work to do. You have to do these exercises. You have to do these activities. You have to take these vitamins. You have to, eliminate these foods or use this particular diet. And it can't work if one parent is following it and the other one isn't, and the child's dividing their time up.
Right.
And so, we need to first and foremost get the parents on the same page, try to create some rules that they all agree to. What happens a lot of times is the moms tend to do a lot of the research on this, and they are a little bit more aware than many of the dads when there's these developmental issues. Moms pick up on these things earlier and they do the research. And sometimes they struggle because the dads may be like, oh, you're exaggerating. It isn't that bad, or it's not really a problem. And they may not support them, or they may not want to pay for different therapies. And it can be very difficult. But if we can get them on the same page and use some objective measurements and say, listen, work together as a team here, then we can get a good outcome.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, would you say in these scenarios, are there differences in how boys versus girls will experience these types of traumatic divorce, breakups, that kind of thing?
Yes, to a certain extent. I think that it kind of depends on your natural attachment style, which could be either a boy or a girl. And you may react it again. Are you more of a right brain dominant person? I think right brain dominant people, because they're so more emotionally sensitive, they may be, and the right brain is where most trauma lives. So, if you have overly sensitive right hemispheres, the threshold for trauma is lower, meaning that with the same amount of problem or emotional distress or traumatic event, it cuts deeper and it lives there. And it kind of lives in that subconscious of the right brain. And it's more difficult. Not that people that are left brain dominant don't feel that and won't be struggle with that, but they're not quite as emotionally vulnerable and they may not manifest it as much, but you can get more anger coming out from that left brain, where they might be a more angry person and a more oppositional person. And that may be accentuated because of this type of situation. Boys and girls, it really depends on their natural personality. I don't think there's that much of a difference or threshold for trauma in male versus females. It really, really cuts down to what's happening with their development and, are they more of a right brain sensitive person or a left brain sensitive person? And I think that feeds into a little bit more.
I know a lot of parents, they worry about how this divorce is going to affect their child long term. Would you say that the role of neuroplasticity plays any role in their healing and can give parents hope on how their child might, grow in the future?
Yeah, well, I always try to I think this perspective is always hopeful because it means that we can change the brain in any situation, no matter what. The brain is never broken. The idea that people can be permanently broken emotionally or mentally from a neuroscience perspective isn't true. Neuroplasticity is the ability of the brain to change. And the brain, as I said, the human brain is the most adaptable brain. The genes that regulate our brain are the most adaptable. They're always active. They never stop being active till the day we die. And the brain can always change. And a lot of these issues that we look at, even now, I think most people look at mental health. And even though we're much more aware and we're much more accepting and much more tolerant and mental health issues are more on people's radar, we still tend to think that, either a person might be weaker or they may tend to think of themselves in terms that I'm weak because I feel this, or I shouldn't feel this. I should just be able to work through it. And really, these aren't mostly psychological issues. These are neurological issues. And it's nobody's fault. And it's not that you're weak. And if you have these issues, it's probably because you're actually pretty talented in an area. And looking at it from that perspective, not that you're a weaker, broken, person that can't deal with things, but rather that you're probably really an exceptionally talented person who developed an imbalance. And that may have started from the very beginning of life where you had no control over that. And you've been struggling your whole life with it. And the good news is it can be changed, and it can be changed pretty easily. And if you're a parent of a child struggling with these things, we can change it. In almost every scenario, we can change it. And it's just a matter of understanding it, understanding what's happening, and really understanding what is actually going on in the brain and what is the root cause. Everything I'm describing here is the root cause. It all starts in the brain, and we can change the brain. There are other things that go along with it, psychological issues, how we're raised, all the things we talked about, abuse, neglect, physical things, illnesses, but most of that stuff is also directly related and even secondary to the brain itself.
Amazing. Dr. Melillo, thank you so much for being here today. Your work is really giving people such a roadmap for what it means to not only support their brains, their kids' brains, and not just their behavior, but how they can shift and have life-changing change for so many families. Anyone listening today who resonated with what we talked about, I want you to know there's always time to understand your wiring, to get support, and to create a more healing environment for the next chapter. We will have links in the show notes to Dr. Melillo's website, to his book, and other resources that may be helpful for you. So thank you so much for joining us today on this episode of Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. Dr. Melillo, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. It was great.
That's a wrap on this episode of Diamonds and Dumpster Fires. If you're walking through the ashes right now, remember, you're not broken. You are becoming. Don't forget to subscribe, share with a friend who needs it, and come back next week for more faith, honesty, and a whole lot of heart. See you next time.